From Texas, Mr. Roy is recognized for 16 minutes as a designee of the Majority Leader.
I thank the Speaker, and I am glad to be here in an empty chamber having the rigorous debate that we are so accustomed to here in the People's House. But that's, again, where we find ourselves with the level of debate at the moment. We're left with bringing bills to the floor, having a couple of hours cut up, and then moving on with whatever bill is put on the suspension calendar. That's not the kind of debate we should have. There's a bill that is coming before us tomorrow that I believe should have vigorous debate. I believe that it does raise consequential issues, and we should debate them here vigorously on the floor of the House. But I want to be unequivocally clear to the American people that I support it, and I support it unapologetically. We have legislation before us that would ensure that foreign adversaries are not able to collect information on the American people, collect data on the American people, use that data to target the American people, undermine our national security, undermine our democracy, and undermine our way of life, which is precisely what is happening with the evidence we have before us. Both classified and very publicly known information indicates very much that TikTok, that has significant ownership by the Chinese Communist Party, that is targeting American citizens. And then there are some who are out professing that this would, legislation that would try to prevent that would somehow undermine our freedom. Now look, I do not like the heavy hand of government being used, certainly not wantonly. An individual today, fairly well known out in the social media sphere, put out and said that we had this classified briefing today, and that the issue of election interference was brought up. This was a classified briefing that was not supposed to leak, by the way. That's how things work in Washington. It was leaked. Then we had the additional point here, not coincidentally, the anti-TikTok legislation. Let me clarify and stop. It is not specifically anti-TikTok legislation. It is anti-foreign adversary control of American data and information legislation. That this legislation, according to this individual, now being debated on the Hill, would allow the federal government to force the sale of any social media platform that interferes in elections, just so you know what's coming in 2025. Now, if I believe that to be true, I certainly wouldn't support the legislation. It is 12 pages long. I would note that a friend of mine who serves on the FCC, Brendan Carr, responded to this, and I happen to agree with Mr. Carr. Mr. Carr wrote, "It would be concerning to many if the bill allowed this." This being the post on X by someone this afternoon that I just recounted. It would be concerning, Mr. Carr says, to many if the bill allowed this. It does not. The text is definitive on this point. The bill does not apply to just any social media platform. Far from it. Here is the only and targeted application, Mr. Carr writes. 1, if you're an individual user, the bill confers zero authority to the government over you. That is true. 2, the bill only applies to applications controlled by one of 4 foreign adversary governments previously codified in law by Congress: China, Iran, North Korea, or Russia. The bill is clear that it is not enough to merely have operations there or do business there. It must be controlled by one of those 4 governments. Number 3, even then, the bill only applies if the application presents a demonstrated and significant threat to national security. Control by one of 4 foreign governments alone isn't even enough under the bill. So you got to have significant ownership by these foreign governments. You've got to have a demonstrated and significant threat to national security. And then, number 4, only after public process provided and Congress reported to with a description of the specific national security threat. Every single one of those hoops and more must be cleared and met. It is very narrow. It confers no authority to go after any other application, even if someone were to allege that it engaged in election interference. What is happening here is a reflexive reaction and a sort of scaremongering tactic. Now, let me pause. I do believe this legislation should have full debate. This is also why I prefer legislation to go through the Rules Committee. This is also why I prefer legislation to be amended, debated. But this bill was passed out. It's trying to be moved so that it doesn't open up for the possibility of undermining the legislation that was very narrowly crafted with a 50-0 vote out of the E&C committee. Now, many of my conservative and more libertarian friends say, well, 50-0 vote gives me the heebie-jeebies and I don't like it. Well, you know what? That's my general default position in this town. But this is different. I want to be very clear. This is different than what I'm about to talk about in just a minute, which is the uniparty in this town that decides everything for you and is bent on whatever the defense industrial complex says and jams through spending bills and limits our ability to proceed. This is different because it is very specific and narrowly tailored towards the end of ensuring that Americans' data and Americans' safety and security are being protected. That's it. It may not be perfect. Nothing this body ever does is perfect. But this bill was put forward to address that issue, and it is a giant step forward, in my opinion, to recognize the threat against our freedom and our liberty that the Chinese Communist Party poses to us, to our children, to our grandchildren. The extent to which they are using algorithms to undermine and focus on our kids. That's what they're doing. They are targeting our children. We know it. They are targeting our people. We know it. They are skewing the data and the results. If you do a search for China virus, now just my utterance of that word make my colleagues on the other side of the aisle's head explode. If you search for China virus, the difference between Instagram, which is hardly some paragon of like right-wing reporting, the difference in the algorithm response on Instagram versus TikTok, it's 400 to 1. The responses you get if you search for China virus. If you search for Hong Kong, I think it's 180 to 1. If you search for Tiananmen Square, I think it is 80 to 1. The fact is, you're getting demonstrably shaped information out of TikTok. And what most people don't understand, most parents at home while their kids are out using TikTok, and this is a parental problem, not just China, China is specifically limiting the information that kids can see in China. They're making sure that the kids in China see patriotic, pro-China, engineering, all of this stuff you want to try to have your kids see in order to make them into what you want to make them. In our country, we are allowing freedom to undermine our freedom. And that's what's actually happening here. It's the false name of freedom, to be clear, to undermine our freedom. It's not actual freedom because the freedom that we have is being attacked by China, and we're sitting back in the false name of freedom saying, oh, no, let's not touch that. I hope that tomorrow we will crack through that. I hope tomorrow, on a bipartisan basis, we will send a message that the Chinese Communist Party cannot knowingly attack us and get a response that is a whimper, because that's what we've been doing so far. If you wanted to destroy America, you would set out and do exactly what China has been doing, bit by bit, targeting our people, undermining our access to information, or at least information that they're trying to control, and target our kids with propaganda. Very specifically. Yes, we have problems with Google, but I'm getting tired of the but Google. Yes, we have problems with Facebook, but I'm tired of the but Facebook, because I get that a lot. The fact is, those things, we want to break up Google? Let's sit down and do it. Happy to have a bipartisan bill to talk about that. You want to deal with Facebook? Happy to have that conversation. You want to talk about the misuse of the power of those big companies, attacking First Amendment rights, targeting people for their political beliefs? Happy to have that conversation. But do you know how hard that is? Because none of us want to use the power of the government to go after companies so that the government is saying what they know is best about what that means for our freedom and our rights here in this country. That's what we're wrestling with under our Constitution, to protect our rights. But when the Chinese Communist Party is actively targeting the American citizens, I'm tired of people hiding behind the flag to let China do it. And that's what's happening. And people are going to do it in the false name of freedom and in the false name of, oh, let's go do this because, I don't know, a former president says so or a media personality says so. How about we do our job here in the House chamber to take on the Chinese Communist Party and not act like they're not doing what they're doing. I think it's important. I support the legislation. I appreciate my friend Mike Gallagher working on it. I co-sponsor it. I will defend it tomorrow. I will defend it in the future. I'm defending it now. I hope we pass it tomorrow on the floor of the House. But I want to bring something up, because that brings up the question of the uniparty in this town. The fact is, we have yet again reverted to the mean. This town has reverted to what it does best, which is a handful of people making decisions, dropping it on the floor, and then walking away from the deliberative process. Now, again, I want to reiterate, the bill I just talked about, I think we should go through committee, and I think we ought to amend it. But we are walking away from our duty that we fought for 14 months ago, to have amendments, to open up debate, to run through the normal, regular order, but more importantly than that even, to actually stand up to the powers that be in this town that make all the decisions. 3 years ago, I stood on the floor and I pointed out that our border was in chaos already, a mere 2 months into the Biden administration. In his first full month in office, federal law enforcement had already encountered more than 100,000 migrants at the border. It was spiking. It was spiking rapidly. And we all knew it. And those of us who went down to the southern border in Texas, we went down and we sounded the alarm, and we got a lot of crickets in this town. That was the beginning of the radical progressive Democrats' efforts to reshape America with mass releases into our country. Just in December, we saw 370,000 migrant encounters alone. 3 years into this crisis, now, radical progressive Democrats are trying to blame the crisis on Republicans. You heard the gentleman, Mr. McGovern from Massachusetts, on the floor of the House today. He said something in the zip code of, Republicans own this crisis now, which, by the way, was a giveaway. It was a tell, because it was purposeful, because our radical Democratic colleagues worked to try to get a bill in the Senate so they'd have something to hide behind. And unfortunately, a handful of Republicans, either wittingly or unwittingly, went along. But the bill died because the bill doesn't do the job. But here's the question. We've got a situation in our country where we've got wide open borders. I'm going to go through some of the details in a minute. And yet, today, we passed a resolution. I supported it. I voted for it. I went to the Rules Committee, did my job, defended it, argued for it, came to the floor, debated it, argued for it. I support it. But come on. It's a resolution. Why? You want to know why? Because we refuse to use the power of the purse to stop President Biden. That's the truth. That's what we're actually doing. Next week, in about 8 or 9 days, this Republican Party will saddle up with that Democratic Party filled with radical progressive Democrats who want to remake America, dump people into the country through mass releases. My Republican colleagues will saddle up with Democrats to pass a funding bill that will fund all of those open borders. And then they'll try to go home and campaign, but I passed a resolution. But I passed a bill that was named after Laken Riley. Aren't I great? Aren't I awesome? The answer to that question is no, you're not. You're not great. You're not awesome. Great and awesome is when you're willing to stand up and fight for the people you said you would fight for when you came here. We control the power of the purse. And I'm tired of the excuses. We had another member of Congress resign today. So now I'll be told, Chip, we only have a 1-seat majority or 2-seat majority. I don't even know what it is anymore. Let me ask you a question. Does it matter? In 2018, we had the House, we had the Senate, we had the White House, and we had a bigger majority than we have today. And we utterly failed to secure the border. Totally dropped the ball. Didn't do it. Why? I remember why. they would say, Chip, we don't have 60 votes in the Senate. Let me be very clear to the American people back home. There is always an excuse for why those who campaign to come to this town fail to deliver. Always. Here's a glimpse into what we will be funding next week. Here's a glimpse into what your members of Congress, both sides of the aisle, led by radical progressive Democrats, who, by the way, you will get more votes out of them than you do out of Republicans. Every bill we have passed over the last 4 or 5 months of consequence have had more Democrat votes than Republican votes. Let's be very clear. That's the truth. You can't hide from the truth. You can't hide behind rules votes. You can't hide behind pointing fingers. This institution, the Republicans that run it, we are giving the ability for bills to come off this floor with more Democrat votes filled with radical progressive Democrats who want to remake America than Republican votes. The last bill, the first half of this omnibus spending bill that spends at Nancy Pelosi's levels, more than Nancy Pelosi's spending levels, cracking the caps that we passed less than a year ago, that legislation passed, I think, with only 2 Democrats voting against it. 2. Do you know who is in the Democratic Party? 2 voted no. I think we had 83 Republicans vote no. You do the math. Which way do you think that bill tilts? Here's what we're going to fund next week. We had 1,200 known gotaways recorded at the border on Sunday alone. In this country, 1,200 people came into this country. We don't know who they are. We don't know where they came from. We don't know what they're doing. But I promise you, for at least a large block of them, they ain't up to good. 1,200 on Sunday. 4 human smuggling loads were caught in 48 hours in Kinney County just this week, just south of San Antonio. These are friends of mine that live in that county. Virginia authorities apprehended an illegal immigrant from Mexico in connection with the February 29th abduction of a 15-year-old unaccompanied alien child. Illegal alien. An illegal alien from Mexico was arrested for allegedly crashing into a Washington State trooper while drunk and high, killing the 27-year-old husband and father. I've gone through and recounted all of the deaths. We've talked about Lake and Riley. We've talked about the 2-year-old who was killed just out of the nation's capital by somebody who was released here by Joe Biden. Meanwhile, criminals with ties to MS-13 and other gangs are selling fake green cards and Social Security cards to illegal aliens on street corners in Queens. That's happening right now. You're going to fund that. A smuggler from Sullivan City led Texas DPS on a high-speed chase in Hidalgo County, just recently arrested for evading human smuggling and DWI. An illegal alien from Venezuela has been charged with manslaughter for a wrong-way accident in Missouri that killed a 12-year-old boy. FBI Director Christopher Wray warned Monday this bureau is very concerned, quote unquote, about a human smuggling network with ties to ISIS that utilizes the southern border to gain entry into the United States. 331 known or suspected terrorists stopped at the border under Biden. 169 in fiscal year 23, 58 so far this year. Members of a Mexican cartel shot at migrants who were taking Ubers to cross the southern border illegally, illegal aliens, leaving 1 woman dead. Nobody crosses the border without cartel permission. They have control. 7.3 illegal aliens crossed our border since Biden took office. That's more than the population of 36 U.S. states. 7.3 million. Nearly 1.8 million known migrants escaped Border Patrol, the gotaways I was talking about before. We have released some 4.5 million of the 7.3 million illegal aliens that crossed our border. 4.5 million we've released. Now, I want to stop there for my radical progressive Democratic colleagues who say that nothing is wrong and they're not doing anything. They're making policy choices to release people into the United States using parole authority against the law to mass release people, including the man that came in here affiliated with a dangerous gang in Venezuela who killed Lake and Riley, not Lincoln Riley. 331 on the terrorist watch list under Biden. 75,000 fentanyl deaths in 2022. The administration has paroled 1 million illegal aliens into this country. many of whom come from Haiti and Venezuela. Pause. Many of whom come from Haiti. Has anybody looked at Haiti recently? There's some dude named Barbecue who's in charge of Haiti at the moment, basically running the show, a dude named Barbecue. We got people, they're running like gangs and marauders of cannibals in Haiti. And now we're going to get a mass influx of people from Haiti. In fiscal year 2023, DHS released more than 233,000 under the Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela categorical parole program. 83,200 Haitians, 65,000 Venezuelans, 49,000 Cubans, 36,000 Nicaraguans. I could go on and on. Chinese nationals. We've had more than 20,000 Chinese nationals encountered at the southern border since October 1, 2023. My friend, Mr. Perry from Pennsylvania, 20,000 Chinese nationals. For context, more than 24,000 Chinese nationals were encountered across the southern border in all of FY23. We've had 20,000 since October 1. I could go down and down and down the list, but I want to give time to my good friend from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, a man who wore the uniform, who served his country with distinction, who serves his country with distinction now as a member of Congress, my friend from Pennsylvania. I assume that you're concerned, as someone who has defended this country around the globe, flew helicopters for the United States military. I assume it concerns you that we've got 20,000 Chinese nationals that we've encountered at the southern border since October 1st, 2023, and that we are poised as Republicans to vote next week to fund fully, with additional money, the government that is doing that to the American people.
I am, my good friend from Texas, 20,000 Chinese, and I think to myself, how did they escape the Communist Party of China? Well, to my good friend Representative Roy, I don't think they escaped. I think the Communist Party of China sent them. The Communist Party of China uses facial recognition software and programs oftentimes created in the United States of America to track every single movement, every decision that the people of China make. And so they know why they're here. We aren't sure why they're here, but I suspect it's not because they love America. It's not because of that, and we're going to fund that. And you know what else we're going to fund? And you mentioned this, but I think it's important to put a boy's name, a little girl's name to this, because that's what it is to many Americans. Travis Wolf, a day away from his 12-year-old birthday, 12 years old. Travis Wolf, one day away from being 12. Unfortunately, Andrina Bracco, here illegally, an illegal foreign national in our country, driving 70 miles an hour in Missouri, the wrong way on the highway, crashed into his and his parents' car. And on March 6th, they took Travis off of life support. He didn't make his 12th, well, he didn't celebrate his 12th birthday. He didn't celebrate it because now he's passed on. And I imagine Travis Wolf's parents are thinking, I live in America. I had fourth grade civics. The Constitution says they're going to defend my family. They're going to defend me against a foreign invasion. I've lost my son. What am I paying taxes for? What am I voting for in this country if you can't keep my son alive at the hands of someone who doesn't belong here? Just a month ago, Travis was doing well and smiling and laughing, and now he's gone, and the parents are left with what? What are the parents left with? The consolation that we pass a bill, a resolution in the House of Representatives that says illegal foreign nationals in the country, that's bad? Well, that doesn't make up for Travis. I guarantee you. I don't know Travis. I don't know his parents, but I'm heartbroken for them. And if no one else will stand up for Travis and his parents, I know Chip Roy from Texas will, and I certainly will as well. How about Elizabeth Medina, murdered in December. Now, her murderer, Rafael Romero, was here illegally. He was a criminal on probation. He was here illegally. He'd already committed crimes, but they let him out. So he stalked Elizabeth. And he went into her apartment where she lived. Elizabeth is 16. She lived with her mother. That's where kids should be, with their parents. But Rafael went in, and he bashed her head in, and he stabbed her to death. She was a cheerleader at her high school with her whole life in front of her in America. America, the place that's supposed to protect its citizens. Supposed to protect its citizens. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's mom now lives in an empty house, I'm sure, heartbroken because her daughter's gone. And why is her daughter gone? Because President Biden says that Rafael Romero and Adrina Bracco deserve to be in America because they came here. And we don't know what their circumstances are, but they deserve to be in America because everybody deserves to be in America. And even though we have a system of legal immigration, the same system that my great-grandmother and my grandmother used to come from Colombia, South America, well, that system's not good enough. Even though we allow 1 million people, the most generous country on the planet, we allow 1 million people to come to America every single year legally. They wait in line, they take the test. They oftentimes know more about American civics than Americans do. But according to President Biden, how many million people, Mr. Roy?
7.3.
7.3 million people can come from all these other countries, don't have to abide by the law, and can kill American citizens. And you know what the insult to injury is to Elizabeth Medina's mother? Next week, we're going to make sure that the federal government is fully funded so they can just keep on doing it, keep on sending the killers, kill American citizens. It is unacceptable. It is unconscionable. And somebody's got to stand up for these folks. Somebody's got to, if the majority of the folks in this chamber won't do it, well, then maybe the majority of this folks in this chamber need to get a different job. I don't know what else to say. We are here to represent the United States of America and our citizens. Our citizens. And when they're dying at the hands of people that are here illegally, that have been arrested for crimes committed, not only the crime of coming to the country illegally, disrespecting the people that pay the bills around here, disrespecting the people that follow the law around here, but then commit crimes in addition to that. And me and Mr. Roy, Madam Speaker, you're expected to vote to fund all that because it's too hard not to. It's just too hard, Mr. Roy from Texas.
I would ask my friend if you'd engage in colloquy for a minute, just so the American people can understand what we're dealing with. Next week, we are going to take up the second half of an omnibus appropriations package. There's no other way to describe it. It was an omnibus bill broken into two parts. That omnibus bill will spend at approximately $1.66 trillion, or, stated in plain terms, $30 billion more than Nancy Pelosi's spending levels passed a mere 15 months ago with abject opposition from the very Republicans in this chamber who are going to vote next week to put the bow around two bills to make one omnibus spending package that will crack the bipartisan caps that we could have at least adhered to limit spending. Is that what the gentleman understands?
That's what I understand. How many months ago did we vote against this?
About 15 months ago.
15 months ago, every single Republican in this chamber voted no on what was and what is just unbelievable spending, unaffordable. We are spending $1 trillion every 100 days now. Every single Republican voted against it. The policy was awful, led to the death of these two individuals. The spending was unaffordable. And now, these months later, we've avoided an omnibus in December so that we can do 2 minibuses in March. And I feel so much better about that. Don't you, Mr. Roy?
To be clear, we are racking up an additional $1 trillion of debt every 100 days.
Additional trillion.
We are spending now this year more on interest than our national defense. We will be cracking $1 trillion of interest in 2026. We are now going to pass a package that spends $1.66 trillion, which the CBO acknowledges will continue to rack up deficits into the foreseeable future. We are going to do that after having voted for a bill last week that funded a number of things, from the Milcon VA to the energy and water to other issues. This next week, though, we're going to be voting on defense. We're going to be voting on state and foreign operations. We're going to be voting on Department of Homeland Security. Now, a lot of these are bills that we passed last year as Republicans in the House. And I would ask the gentleman, when we passed legislation last year, we passed legislation to push back on the radical progressive Democrat agenda in the state and foreign operations bill that we'll take up next week, that I would remind that the United Nations is a part of, to the tune of $12.5 billion. Now, by the way, Texas has had to spend $12.5 billion over the last 3 years to defend itself when the federal government won't do it. But we're going to have $12.5 billion for the United Nations. That is going to be funded this next week by this body, a United Nations, which, let's see if the gentleman agrees, has the United Nations Human Rights Council, which passed condemnatory resolutions on Israel 104 times to China's 0. A United Nations Population Fund, which is complicit in China's population control programs. The World Health Organization, complicit in COVID-19. UNRWA, I know the gentleman's familiar with this one. UNRWA, the corrupt organization that was been exposed since October 7th in terms of its engagement in the barbaric attacks by Hamas on the people of Israel. We're funding it. Now Biden says he's not funding it, but will we make that clear next week? We did last fall. We made it clear, but not clear enough. Why is that? What did the gentleman do last fall?
We had an amendment on the floor to defund the United Nations Relief and Works Agency that funds directly Hamas. Unfortunately, it didn't pass. And then within days of that, Hamas attacked Israel.
And it didn't pass because it didn't have unanimity among Republicans.
That's correct.
And so now, will we vote this week to fund UNRWA? Now, even if UNRWA is taken out, which it's possible that it will be, even if it's taken out, will we continue to fund all of the so-called humanitarian relief that is still getting funneled to Hamas?
Well, what about the funding to the United Nations that is then funneled to south of the border, right, which is used to pay the cartels to move people from 150-plus countries through my good friend Chip Roy's district in Texas to the rest of the United States, funding the people that are taking the life of Travis Wolfe and Elizabeth Medina, funding those people.
Will we continue to fund, through the State and Foreign Operations Bill, the president's radical anti-life agenda? Will we pass instead any of the pro-life protections like the Mexico City policy, or no? What will we be funding? Continuation of the radical anti-life policies of this administration. Will we be voting to end, or will we be voting to fund all of the manner of wasteful and woke international envoys? The special envoy for racial equity and justice, the special envoy to advance the human rights of LGBTQI persons, the special envoy for international labor, the special representative for Palestinian affairs. Will we be voting to fund that next week?
I suspect that we will get almost twice as many votes from that side of the aisle for a bill brought by a Republican majority. And the reason why that is because most of their priorities, the vast majority of their priorities, are funded.
The gentleman served in the United States Army, correct?
Correct.
The gentleman flew helicopters in the United States Army.
Correct.
Rose to the ranks of the title general, correct?
Correct.
Do you believe that we should be next week, as Republicans, voting to fund chief diversity officers across the Department of Defense that are destroying recruiting and turning our military into a social engineering experiment? With the Air Force reducing planned troop totals in their 2025 budget, cutting the total number of airmen of the service after missing its recruiting goals. How about transgender surgeries at the Department of Defense being funded? How about the Department of Defense's abortion tourism funding? How about funding for a Department of Defense that has failed to fully reinstate members impacted by its vaccine mandates, at least 8,000, one of whom I just spoke with the other night randomly at a bar restaurant here in the area in Northern Virginia, who was upset that he got forced out of service in the United States military. Does the gentleman think we should be funding that?
You know that I will be registering a strong no in objection to those things that are destroying the greatest military the planet has ever known.
Yet will not the very same people that will stand up and say we must fund this do so on the back of the men and women in uniform, saying that we must do this for defense. We must do this to make our defense stronger. Will they not be voting for all of those policies undermining our own Defense Department?
They will indeed.
On both sides of the aisle.
On both sides of the aisle.
How about the HHS funding that we're going to be taking up next week, including the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which lost track, as the gentleman knows, of 85,000 migrant children, according to that bastion of right-wing conspiracy, the New York Times, and is working with the NGOs to make the crisis worse. The very NGOs that are receiving funding from the United Nations, the gentleman from Pennsylvania just acknowledged, we're going to fund the United Nations. We're going to fund through our own HHS, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which lost 85,000 children, and we're not going to demand the changes necessary. Is the gentleman concerned about that?
Of course, we're all concerned. We can't, it's unconscionable. That our detractors, those who disagree with us, say that our position on the border is inhumane, but I would submit that losing track of 85,000 children who, just let your mind wander, or God knows dealing with what right now, turned over by cartels to other cartel members in the United States for just horrific circumstances, and yet we're supposed to just turn our face from that and act like, well, that's the cost of doing business.
Does the gentleman agree that we'll be fully funding Joe Biden's student loan bailout schemes that were found to be unlawful by the United States Supreme Court, and he literally stood at a microphone and said, I don't care, I'm doing it anyway? Do you think we ought to be funding that?
Of course not.
Should we be funding, for example, the under COVID, the continued funding of the Wuhan lab, or anything with respect to EcoHealth Alliance, or without any accountability for any of the people that sent our entire economy into a tailspin, racking up $8 trillion of debt, sending our kids back in time in terms of their ability to compete? Should we be continuing to fund those things?
There's no American, left, right, or center, listening to this list that says, sign me up to support that.
I guess now, in conclusion on this point, back to the border. An absolute tragedy that is unfolding for Americans reeling like Lake and Riley's parents, like Lizbeth's mom. By the way, you left out the fact, and I understand, that she was supposed to be cheering at an event. Her mom went there to go see her daughter, and when her daughter didn't show up, she had to go home to find her daughter's lifeless body in a bathtub. Killed by somebody here illegally, an illegal alien. And again, I want to be very clear. The President of the United States, whether he knows it or not, a subject that we explored today in a Judiciary Committee, whether it's willful or not, he's certainly complicit, because the buck stops with the president, that they are releasing people into the United States in mass form, contrary to law, and endangering people like Lake and Riley, like Lizbeth, like the 2-year-old out here in Montgomery County, like hundreds of examples, thousands of fentanyl deaths. And by the way, put all that aside. The fact is, we're destroying our country through the weight of what that means for our school districts, our prisons, our hospitals, what it means for health care. We have 50 million foreign-born people in this country. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle act like somehow this is anti-immigrant, or that we don't want to have immigrants in the United States, when nothing could be further from the truth. I assume that the vast majority of the people that I know working at the Border Patrol, for example, who I know to be majority Hispanic, they want the law to be enforced. I assume that we want to back the people who want the law enforced. Yet, we're going to, I want to be clear, fund all the things we just articulated and fund a Department of Homeland Security to continue to carry out mass releases in the form of parole, asylum, abuse of the law, undermining our security and safety. And by the way, I would point out, We are going to continue to fund the salary of Alejandro Mayorkas, whom we impeached for violating his oath to the Constitution, violating the laws, and endangering the American people. How does the gentleman feel about that?
It's just astounding. It is astounding that that is our circumstance, yet that's where we find ourselves, and that's where Americans find themselves. I mean, I have some of the folks that know me say, oh, you're so dramatic. You're so dramatic about it, and it's really not that bad. Immigration's always been an issue. It hasn't changed that much. You're just trying to increase people's anxiety. You're over the top. But I guarantee you, I don't know him, but I guarantee you, Travis Wolf's parents, Elizabeth Medina's mother, there's nothing more dramatic than losing your child. Laken Riley's parents, there's nothing more dramatic. And the hopelessness that they must feel at the inability to do anything about it, knowing that this is happening in the country, knowing that we know. They know we know. We read the news, we see the names, we hear the stories. But we're going to fund it. And what are we going to say to them when we fund it? It's the best we could do? That's the best we could do. I know that Mr. Roy feels the same way. No one else is here. Speaker's here. Mr. Roy from Texas is here. I'm here. I'm sure there's a lot going on in Washington, D.C. tonight. I'm sure there is. We're going to use this time to honor and to acknowledge Travis Wolf, Elizabeth Medina, Laken Riley, the 100,000 Pennsylvanians died of drug overdose last year. That's happening for a reason. It's happening because these drugs are coming across our border. The cartels are running them. China's providing them. And America, under this president, is doing nothing to stop it.
The America I know enforces the rule of law. The America I know establishes a rule of law that attracts people from the world to come to our country. That's why people come to the United States of America, is because the rule of law affords them the ability to prosper. And yet we are undermining the very thing that attracts people from around the world to come here. I know it's equality, justice, freedom, but if you don't have the rule of law, none of those things matter. If you don't have the rule of law, you have chaos. If you don't have the rule of law, you have what's happening in Haiti. If you don't have the rule of law, you don't have a country. If you don't have sovereignty and borders, you don't have a country. If you don't have that, then there is no America to stand side by side with Israel. If you don't have that, there is no America to even try to come to the rescue of any country like Ukraine or anybody else. If you don't have a country, you have nothing on this earth to be able to organize, to be able to defend the very liberty that we say this country stands for. I would note that this body, Republicans, passed H.R. 2 just under a year ago. That bill would demonstrably change the situation at the border. It would enforce the law. It would reestablish the rule of law. It would still allow people to come here and make claims when they need them if they're being persecuted for their religious beliefs or political beliefs. But they would do so through the normal order. The chaos would end. America would be better off. The Western Hemisphere would be better off. The world would be better off. Most of the individuals seeking to come to this country would frankly be better off, so they're not being abused by cartels or being forced to run from the Darien Gap all the way up through Mexico to come up through this tough journey to come to America, than to get here and have difficulty. Why do I want to bring that up? And I'm going to be wrapping up here reasonably shortly so we can give the floor to another colleague. But why does it matter that we passed that bill last year? Because it's a good bill. It's a bill that would do the job. While my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are playing games, trying to hide behind legislation in the Senate that never would have gotten the job done. And our colleague from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, today said, and he gave up the game on the floor today when he said, Republicans now own this. I'm sorry, they said Republicans own this issue now. It was purposeful. He gave it up. He gave away the game. They want to hide behind a bill they knew wouldn't pass. We passed legislation that would make a difference. It would save people's lives, be better for migrants, better for our country. But here's the thing. I hear a lot of my colleagues on this side of the aisle run around and say something like, well, can we just get migrant protection protocols? Can we just get Remain in Mexico? Let me be very clear. That will not fix it. Because if you simply pass migrant protection protocol requirements, the president can just ignore them. If you do not end the releases, if you do not force an end to the releases, which, by the way, I did in a 3-page bill, then you have no border security. You cannot implement remain in Mexico and believe that that alone will solve the problem. When parole is being abused, asylum is being abused, unaccompanied children will be abused. But that's what some of our colleagues, even on this side of the aisle, are saying will be a solution if we package it together with Ukraine or Israel to move a bill. Let me be very clear to everybody watching, to any of our colleagues sitting in their offices watching, that is not good enough. It won't work. Don't bring that to the floor. That's not the way we should go. At the end of the day, earlier today, this chamber passed a resolution condemning the Biden administration for its failures at the border, for releasing people into the United States. Every Republican voted for it. Every Republican voted for it. Fine. What will it do? What will it actually do? I voted for it. The president should be condemned. But how many of those same Republicans are going to vote next week to fund fully at a higher level the very things they voted against, or condemned, I should say, in the resolution that they just passed today? What do you think, my friend from Pennsylvania?
It's going to be quite a number of, unfortunately, it's going to be quite a number of Republicans that this week they'll say they condemn the Biden administration for dereliction of duty, the lost lives created by wide open borders, and then next week they'll say, well, we didn't have any choice. We had to fund it. We didn't have any choice. There was nothing more we could do. And that's the sad state of affairs. And that's how your country ends up $34 trillion in debt, racking up $100 trillion every 100 days of additional debt, with murderers who have been caught by the law out running around here illegally, killing American citizens. That's how you end up with that. And unfortunately, that's what we're headed for. We're supposed to take a victory lap because it didn't happen in December. It wasn't the pre-Christmas omnibus. So that's a win. That's something to celebrate. That's what I'm told. But I guarantee you, Elizabeth's mom and Travis's parents, they're not celebrating that. They want something done. They demand something be done. They can't bring back their loved ones, but we can damn sure make sure that that doesn't happen to anyone else. And the way to do it is to stop funding this wide open border. And people that say, well, you passed H.R. 2, it's dead on arrival in the Senate, they're never going to take it up, you have to accept something less. Well, how about we accept something less that's this? How about this president institute the same policies that he eviscerated on day one of his presidency, and at least start bringing us back to some semblance of a nation that has a border and that is sovereign, that is determining its own destiny?
I'll close with this. In a couple of years, this country is going to be celebrating its 250th birthday on July 2nd, 2026. The question we've got to ask ourselves is whether or not we're going to have a country that we pass down to our kids and our grandkids. I believe we can and that we will. But I believe that we only will if the people who campaign and go to the people saying that they're going to change this town, saying that they're going to stop the unlimited spending, saying that they're going to do something about $1 trillion of debt racked up every 100 days, saying they're going to do something about $1 trillion of interest in 2026, or spending more on interest than our national defense, saying that they're going to secure the border of the United States, saying that they're going to end the woke and weaponized government targeting the American people, saying that they're going to make sure that we don't have endless wars that are making our military overstretched and overrun and making it difficult for our men and women in uniform with a woke military, undermining their ability to recruit and have a military that functions. When our colleagues go out and campaign on those things, we should deliver. We should do something about it. And we should be willing to give up the precious, to quote the Lord of the Rings, give up the precious of an election certificate if it means taking the steps necessary to fight for this country. when the founders gave us the power of the purse, articulated well in Federalist 58 by James Madison and otherwise throughout the founding documents, that power of the purse was supposed to be used. Because if you don't use it, what do you have left? An impeachment that you send over to the Senate to die in the Senate and then go campaign on it? Because the balance of power matters. The separation of power matters. And when a president of the United States is ignoring the law and ignoring the Supreme Court, violating all of the norms of the past to undermine our sovereignty, endanger the American people, spend money we don't have, ignore the law, make us weaker around the globe. When the President of the United States is doing those things, it is incumbent upon the House and the Senate, but particularly the House, to do something about it. And you shouldn't hide behind rules votes and thin majorities and what the Senate has or doesn't have to say that we could use that power of the purse to force change out of a president. I, for one, believe that on July 2nd, 2026, we're going to be able to stand up and say that we're doing the right thing. I believe something is stirring in this country. I believe people are seeing what's actually happening. I believe people are seeing their country being taken away from them. And we're seeing the people like Riley Gaines standing up, and we're seeing people like Chloe Cole stand up against the Madison, Scott Smith in Loudoun County. We're seeing the people around this country stand up and make their voices be heard, and the parents who've taken their schools back, the parents who stood up in Texas and just had a strong election to try to force that state to stand up for universal school choice, to empower parents rather than bureaucrats to stand up for our kids. I believe that the American people are right now going through a great awakening. And it is time for the people in this body to catch up to the people. It is time for the people in this body to stand up and do our part to make sure we restore that constitutional order and the very premise outlined in the Declaration of Independence for the pursuit of happiness, so that in July of 2026, we can say that our people live in a free country and that we have, in fact, kept the republic, to quote Franklin, after the Constitutional Convention. With that, I yield back.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 9, 2023, the Chair recognizes a gentleman from California, Mr. Kiley, for 30 minutes.